"Eat, old witch," my daughter-in-law said loudly enough for every guest to hear, and in that single moment I realized the happiest day of my son's life had quietly become the day my place in the family disappeared. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply looked around the ballroom and noticed something no one else seemed to notice. Nearly every phone had stopped recording the first dance and had turned toward me instead. Everyone thought they were witnessing the end of an old woman's dignity. None of them knew I had already carried the beginning of the truth inside my purse. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I was 68 years old on the day my son Daniel married Vanessa Collins. The ceremony took place at a beautiful country club outside Denver, where the late afternoon sun poured through tall windows and painted the white tablecloths with a warm golden light. Fresh flowers lined every aisle, soft piano music drifted across the room, and every detail had been planned with remarkable precision. It should have been one of those family memories people treasure forever. I had believed that for months. My late husband, Michael, used to say that weddings weren't only about two people beginning a new life. They were also about families choosing to become one. After losing him 3 years earlier, I held on to those words more tightly than I admitted to anyone. I wanted Daniel to be happy. I wanted him to know that even though his father wasn't sitting in the front row, our family still stood together. I arrived early wearing the navy blue dress Michael had once surprised me with on our 40th anniversary. The fabric no longer fit quite as perfectly as it once had, but when I looked in the mirror that morning, I heard his voice telling me I looked beautiful anyway. That memory stayed with me all day. Guests smiled politely as they walked past me. Some recognized me immediately. Others simply assumed I was another elderly relative. I didn't mind. I had reached an age where being overlooked hurt less than being misunderstood. Daniel hugged me before the ceremony began. It was brief, distracted, almost automatic, but I treasured it anyway. Vanessa smiled for the photographers with effortless perfection. Every curl of her hair seemed carefully placed. Every laugh arrived exactly when someone lifted a camera. She looked like the picture of a perfect bride, and perhaps that was why so few people ever noticed the sharpness hiding behind her polished smile. During the reception I tried to stay out of the spotlight. I complimented the flowers, thanked the catering staff, and chatted with Michael's old friend George Harris, who quietly admitted he hadn't seen Daniel much since the engagement. There was concern in his eyes, but neither of us wanted to spoil the celebration by speaking openly. Then dinner was served. The room filled with cheerful conversation as waiters carried plates of pasta topped with fresh tomato sauce. Someone proposed a toast. Laughter echoed against the high ceiling. Glasses clinked together. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe the difficult months behind us had finally passed. Vanessa approached my chair carrying a small bowl of warm tomato sauce from the serving table. She wore a bright smile that looked almost theatrical. Several guests turned toward us, expecting some playful wedding tradition I hadn't heard about. Instead, she leaned close enough for only those nearby to hear her first. "You always wanted to be the center of attention," she whispered with a smile that never reached her eyes. Before I could answer, she made an abrupt gesture that left sauce splashed across the front of my dress and prompted a chorus of shocked gasps around the room. Then she laughed and repeated much louder, "Eat, old witch." Silence arrived faster than any music ever could. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Chairs scraped lightly across polished floors. Even the photographers lowered their cameras for a second before instinctively raising them again. I looked down at my stained dress, then slowly lifted my eyes toward my son. Daniel stood frozen beside the head table. His face carried confusion, embarrassment, and something even more painful, hesitation. He didn't step forward. He didn't speak. He simply stood there as though waiting for someone else to decide what should happen next. That silence hurt far more than the ruined dress ever could. I reached into my handbag for a linen handkerchief Michael had given me years ago, gently cleaned the stain as best I could, and straightened my shoulders. I refused to let anger become the final memory people carried from that room. As whispers spread through the ballroom, I noticed George watching me with quiet concern. I also noticed another guest discreetly lowering a phone after recording everything that had just happened. Vanessa smiled confidently, convinced the evening still belonged entirely to her. She had no idea that long before this wedding invitation had arrived, Michael had anticipated a day when appearances would matter less than character. Resting inside my purse, beneath the handkerchief and my reading glasses, was a sealed envelope I had promised never to open unless my family forgot the meaning of respect. As I placed one steady hand over the clasp of my handbag, I understood that promise had finally reached its day. I walked out of the ballroom before anyone could decide whether they should comfort me or pretend nothing had happened. The evening air felt cool against my face, and for the first time in several hours I could breathe without forcing myself to smile. Behind me I could still hear faint music drifting from the reception hall, followed by scattered applause as someone tried to rescue the celebration from the uncomfortable silence that had settled over it. I sat alone on a wooden bench overlooking the small lake beside the country club and carefully folded Michael's handkerchief before placing it back into my purse. The stain on my dress would probably never come out completely, but the dress itself no longer mattered. What stayed with me was the expression on Daniel's face. He had looked at me the way a frightened child looks at a problem too large to understand, except he was no longer a child. He was a grown man beginning a new chapter of his life, and somehow I had become a stranger standing just outside the door of that new beginning. As I watched the reflection of the lights shimmer across the water, my thoughts drifted backward to 6 months before the wedding, long before any guest had mailed back a response card, long before floral arrangements and seating charts had become family conversations. It began so quietly that I almost missed it. After Daniel announced his engagement, I truly wanted Vanessa to feel welcomed into our family. I invited her to lunch, asked about her parents, listened to stories about her career, and even offered her my late mother-in-law's pearl earrings as a wedding gift. She thanked me politely, but there was always something carefully measured about her kindness. It never felt spontaneous. Every compliment sounded rehearsed, every smile ended a little too quickly whenever she believed no one was watching. At first I blamed myself. Perhaps I was simply an anxious mother learning to let go of her only son. Michael had always balanced my tendency to worry. Whenever I imagined the worst, he would gently remind me to give people time. After he passed away, I found myself trying to hear his voice whenever uncertainty crept into my thoughts. So I kept giving Vanessa more chances. I volunteered to help address invitations. I spent entire weekends comparing reception venues with her. I even drove nearly 40 miles one Saturday morning to deliver homemade cinnamon rolls because she had mentioned missing the ones her grandmother used to bake. She accepted every gesture graciously, yet our conversations never grew warmer. They remained perfectly polite, like business meetings wrapped inside family dinners. Around the same time, Daniel slowly began changing in ways that were difficult to explain to anyone else. He no longer called every Sunday afternoon as he had done for years. When I invited the couple over for dinner, he often answered with short messages saying they already had plans. Holidays became negotiations instead of traditions. Thanksgiving was shortened because they needed to visit friends afterward. Christmas morning became Christmas evening. Birthdays turned into quick restaurant lunches instead of afternoons spent around the old dining room table where Michael had carved the turkey every November for nearly 3 decades. None of these moments seemed important by themselves. Together they formed a quiet pattern that settled over my life like early winter frost. Even my neighbors noticed the difference. Mrs. Alvarez from across the street once asked whether Daniel had moved out of state because she had not seen his truck in months. I laughed and said he was simply busy building a future with his fiancée, but after returning inside my empty house I realized I had been trying to convince myself as much as her. One afternoon I visited the cemetery carrying fresh white lilies for Michael. I had done that on the first Saturday of every month since losing him. Sitting beside his headstone had become my way of speaking aloud without worrying whether anyone agreed with me. I told him about the wedding plans, about the guest list, about the color of the bridesmaids' dresses, and finally about the uncomfortable feeling I could not quite explain. I remember smiling at the photograph engraved into the stone as though he might answer back. Instead, a gentle breeze rustled through the maple trees surrounding the cemetery. It reminded me of something he once said after a difficult family disagreement many years earlier. Character is not revealed during comfortable seasons. It appears when people believe there will be no consequences for their choices. At the time I thought he had been talking about business. Sitting there beside him, I wondered if perhaps he had understood people better than I ever had. When I returned home that afternoon, I unlocked the front door and noticed the house felt unusually quiet. The old grandfather clock echoed through the hallway. Sunlight filtered across framed family photographs lining the staircase. In nearly every picture, Daniel was standing beside Michael, both of them smiling without effort. I paused in front of one photograph from Daniel's college graduation and realized that I could not remember the last time we had taken a family picture that felt as natural as that one. I brushed away the thought and continued into my study, unaware that the unanswered questions quietly collecting in my heart would soon lead me toward a promise Michael had left behind, a promise I had hoped I would never have to keep. The weeks that followed quietly confirmed what my heart had already begun to suspect. Vanessa did not try to become part of our family. She slowly reshaped it until every tradition revolved around her preferences, and Daniel adjusted himself so naturally that I sometimes wondered whether he even noticed the changes. The first sign came during a Sunday dinner that had been a Brooks family tradition for nearly 20 years. Michael believed that no matter how busy life became, sharing one meal every week reminded people that home was more than a place. Daniel had rarely missed those dinners while his father was alive. After the engagement, however, excuses became routine. One Sunday Vanessa explained that they had joined a neighborhood wine club. The next week there was a coworker's birthday. Then a weekend getaway. Eventually the invitations stopped feeling like invitations at all. They became polite reminders that I already knew would end with disappointment. I never complained. I simply prepared smaller meals and quietly packed leftovers into containers that filled my refrigerator for days afterward. When they did visit, our conversations felt strangely rehearsed. Daniel asked about my health, complimented the roast, and checked his phone every few minutes. Vanessa complimented my house but immediately suggested ways it could be modernized if it ever changed owners. At first those comments sounded harmless. She admired the hardwood floors. She liked the large backyard. She mentioned how perfect the guest rooms would be for future children. Then she began asking practical questions that seemed oddly specific. Had I updated my insurance policy recently? Did I still keep important papers inside the study? Had I considered downsizing now that I lived alone? Each question arrived with a pleasant smile, yet together they left me with a quiet feeling I could not explain. One rainy afternoon she accompanied me while I sorted old family photographs in the living room. We laughed over Daniel's elementary school pictures, his crooked baseball cap, and the awkward braces he had hated wearing. I believed we were finally beginning to understand each other. Then she picked up a framed photograph of Michael, standing beside the oak tree he planted the year Daniel was born. She smiled politely before placing it face down on the coffee table so she could make room for a decorative candle she had purchased. It was a tiny gesture that lasted only seconds, but something inside me tightened. Michael had always occupied the center of our home, even after he was gone. Watching his photograph casually moved aside felt symbolic in a way I could not ignore. I quietly returned the frame to its original place after she left, telling myself not to overthink such a small moment. Yet those small moments continued multiplying. She rearranged seats during family meals without asking. She volunteered to answer questions directed at Daniel before he had the chance to speak. She often referred to my house as though it belonged to the next generation already, describing future renovations while I was still living there. None of those actions were openly disrespectful. Each one existed comfortably within the boundaries of good manners. Together, however, they slowly erased the feeling that I still belonged inside my own family's future. George Harris noticed it too. We met for coffee one Wednesday morning at the little diner Michael had loved for years. George stirred his coffee in silence before finally saying, "Your husband always paid attention to the things other people overlooked." I smiled sadly because that observation sounded exactly like Michael. George hesitated before continuing. He once told me that confidence can hide kindness, but it can also hide ambition. The difference only appears when someone believes they have already won. His words lingered with me long after we left the restaurant. That evening I stood alone in my study looking across shelves filled with family albums, military medals that had belonged to my father, and books Michael had collected throughout our marriage. The room carried the familiar scent of polished wood and old paper. It was the one place in the house that still felt untouched by time. My eyes settled on the antique desk where Michael had spent countless evenings balancing household accounts or writing birthday cards to Daniel. Inside its top drawer rested a small brass key taped beneath a handwritten note in Michael's unmistakable handwriting. The note contained only one sentence. "If the day ever comes when respect is replaced by convenience, you will know what this key is for." I held the key in my palm for several minutes, remembering the promise I had made after his funeral never to search for hidden answers unless life truly demanded them. Until that moment I had convinced myself such a day would never arrive. Standing alone in the fading evening light, with silence filling every corner of the house we had built together, I realized that promise was no longer protected by hope. It was slowly becoming a responsibility. For almost 2 weeks I left the brass key exactly where Michael had hidden it because part of me still believed I was simply imagining patterns where none existed. Every marriage changes after a child grows up. Every family adjusts when new people enter. I repeated those thoughts each morning while making coffee in the quiet kitchen, hoping they would eventually sound true. Yet every passing day brought another small reminder that something deeper had shifted beneath the surface. Daniel stopped dropping by without calling first. When he did visit, his attention drifted toward his watch or his telephone before we had finished a single cup of coffee. Vanessa usually remained cheerful, but her questions continued circling the same subjects. She wanted to know whether I planned to travel after the wedding. She wondered if maintaining a large house felt exhausting. She suggested that many retirees enjoyed moving into modern condominiums closer to downtown. None of those ideas were unreasonable by themselves, but they arrived with surprising frequency, as though someone were gently testing how firmly I intended to remain rooted in the life Michael and I had built together. One Saturday afternoon Daniel offered to help organize the garage. I welcomed the company because we had not spent meaningful time together in months. We sorted old fishing equipment, Christmas decorations, and boxes filled with school projects he had made as a little boy. For nearly an hour everything felt wonderfully familiar. Then Vanessa walked inside carrying lemonade and casually pointed towards several storage shelves. She smiled and said those old boxes probably did not need to be kept forever because young families usually preferred clean spaces without so much history taking up room. Daniel nodded almost immediately and agreed they should probably be donated someday. I looked at the cardboard box nearest my feet and recognized Daniel's third-grade science fair project, the one Michael had proudly displayed in his office for years. It suddenly occurred to me that memories hold very different value depending on who is carrying them. To me they were pieces of a life. To someone else they could become clutter waiting to be removed. That evening after they left, I wandered slowly through every room of the house. The grandfather clock chimed 7 times. The dining room still held the oak table where Michael insisted everyone sit together without distractions. The study remained exactly as he had left it on his final afternoon at home. His favorite fountain pen rested beside an unfinished crossword puzzle. His reading glasses still lay inside the top drawer because I had never found the heart to move them. Standing there, I finally understood why he had hidden the key instead of simply handing it to me. He had wanted me to trust my own judgment rather than live in constant suspicion. The key was never meant to create doubt. It was meant to wait until doubt had already become impossible to ignore. I carefully removed the key from beneath the drawer and held it in my hand. Its brass surface had grown slightly darker with age, but the weight felt reassuring, almost familiar. I remembered the small fireproof safe tucked behind a row of law books inside the built-in bookcase. Michael had installed it years earlier after a neighborhood burglary, although he rarely mentioned what he kept inside. I had respected his privacy because our marriage had never been built on secrecy. If he believed something should remain unopened until the proper time, I trusted him completely. My hands trembled slightly as I unlocked the hidden compartment. The safe opened with a soft, metallic click that echoed through the silent study. Inside were several neatly arranged folders, a velvet jewelry box, and one large cream-colored envelope with my name written across the front in Michael's unmistakable handwriting. I did not reach for it immediately. Instead, I sat quietly in his leather chair, allowing the room to settle around me. Dust floated through the late afternoon sunlight. Somewhere outside, a lawn-mower hummed in the distance. Ordinary sounds continued exactly as they always had, even though I sensed my own life had reached a turning point. After several steady breaths, I lifted the envelope and gently broke the seal. Folded inside was a handwritten letter beginning with words that instantly brought tears to my eyes. My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, it means your generous heart has waited as long as it possibly could before asking whether the people around you are protecting your kindness or quietly taking advantage of it. I prayed you would never need this letter. But if that day has arrived, then promise me one thing before you read another page. Do not answer hurt with anger. Answer it with truth. Michael's handwriting never wavered, even on the final pages of the letter. Every sentence carried the same calm confidence that had steadied our family through decades of ordinary struggles and unexpected storms. I read each line slowly, hearing his voice as clearly as if he were sitting across the desk from me. He wrote that kindness was never weakness, but kindness without wisdom could become an invitation for the wrong people to take more than they deserved. He reminded me that protecting my dignity was not the same as seeking revenge. Those words settled deeply inside me because they sounded exactly like the man I had loved for 45 years. Halfway through the letter, he explained why he had prepared the safe so carefully. During the final year of his life, while quietly arranging our financial affairs, he had noticed subtle conversations that troubled him. Nobody had openly threatened or deceived us. Instead, he observed an unusual curiosity about our home, our investments, and the legal documents we kept. He admitted that he never wanted to accuse anyone based on instinct alone, yet he believed it was his responsibility to prepare for every possibility. Beneath the letter rested several neatly labeled folders. One contained copies of our estate plan. Another listed every major account, property record, and insurance policy. A third folder held a series of handwritten notes describing conversations Michael had considered important enough to remember. None of the notes accused anyone of wrongdoing. They simply recorded dates, places, and comments that had seemed insignificant at the time. Reading them together created a picture that was impossible to ignore. More than once Michael had written that Vanessa repeatedly steered conversations toward inheritance, ownership, or future control of the family home. On another page he described how Daniel had appeared uncomfortable whenever those topics surfaced, often changing the subject before leaving the room entirely. Michael had underlined one sentence twice. Daniel is not acting like himself. I believe he is trying to keep peace rather than make decisions. That observation broke my heart because it matched exactly what I had been witnessing ever since the engagement. At the bottom of the folder rested a business card for Richard Coleman, the attorney who had handled our estate planning for nearly 20 years. Attached to it was a handwritten note from Michael. If you ever begin doubting your own judgment, speak with Richard before speaking with anyone else. I placed the card on the desk and continued reading. The final envelope inside the safe contained a sealed statement from Richard himself. It explained that certain legal documents had been intentionally structured to protect me during my lifetime. Michael had insisted that those protections remain private unless circumstances made them necessary. The letter did not reveal every detail, but it reassured me that no important decision regarding the house or family assets could move forward without my full knowledge and voluntary consent. For the first time in months I felt something I had almost forgotten. I felt steady. Not because every problem had disappeared, but because uncertainty had finally been replaced with clarity. I was no longer guessing whether my instincts had misled me. Michael had noticed the same quiet changes long before I had. He had simply hoped they would never grow into something larger. As evening settled outside, I carefully returned every document to its folder except Richard's business card. I slipped it into my wallet instead of placing it back inside the safe. Then I locked the compartment and returned the brass key to my pocket. I was not preparing for a confrontation. I was preparing to understand the truth completely before making a single decision. The following morning I called Richard's office shortly after 9 o'clock. His assistant recognized my name immediately and gently asked whether everything was all right. I paused before answering because I realized the honest response was more complicated than I could explain over the telephone. I simply said that I had found something Michael wanted me to discuss with Richard whenever the time felt right. There was a brief silence before she replied that Richard had reserved an opening for me the very next afternoon. After hanging up, I stood at the kitchen window watching autumn leaves drift across the backyard Michael had loved so dearly. The world outside looked peaceful, almost unchanged. Yet deep inside I knew I had crossed an invisible line. Until then I had been reacting to uncomfortable moments one at a time, hoping each one was isolated. Now I finally understood they belonged to a much larger story, and somewhere ahead the answers waiting for me would determine whether my family had simply drifted apart or whether someone had been quietly guiding it in that direction all along. Richard Coleman greeted me with the same quiet professionalism he had shown our family for decades. His office looked exactly as I remembered it, with shelves lined by leather-bound law books, framed certificates, and photographs of local charities that he and Michael had supported together over the years. He did not begin by discussing legal documents. Instead, he poured 2 cups of coffee, invited me to sit near the window, and asked a simple question. "Eleanor, what finally convinced you to open the safe?" I thought carefully before answering. I did not describe the reception hall or the humiliation I had experienced. I simply told him that I had reached a moment when my own judgment no longer felt sufficient. Richard nodded with quiet understanding, as though he had expected that answer all along. He reached into a filing cabinet and removed a thick folder with my name printed neatly across the tab. "Michael instructed me to keep these records sealed unless you personally requested them," he explained. He believed that trust should always come before suspicion. But he also believed preparation was an act of love. Together we reviewed every page inside the folder. None of it contained dramatic revelations or secret fortunes hidden from the family. Instead, it revealed something far more meaningful. Michael had carefully structured every important decision so that no one could pressure me into surrendering my home or my financial independence without my full understanding and written consent. Richard explained that Michael worried less about outright dishonesty than about emotional pressure. He often told me that Eleanor's greatest strength is also her greatest vulnerability, Richard said with a gentle smile. He admired your generous heart, but he wanted to make certain generosity could never be mistaken for obligation. I felt tears gather in my eyes, not from sadness but from gratitude. Even after his passing, Michael had continued protecting me in the only way he still could. Richard then opened another section of the file containing detailed notes from meetings held during the previous 2 years. One entry caught my attention immediately. Several months before Michael died, Daniel and Vanessa had accompanied him to discuss general estate planning. According to Richard's notes, Daniel spoke very little throughout the meeting, while Vanessa asked numerous questions about future property management, timelines, and possible ownership transfers after Michael's death. Richard looked at me carefully before speaking again. "There was nothing improper about those questions," he said calmly. "Families ask practical questions every day." What concerned Michael was not the questions themselves. It was that they continued returning to the same subject while he was trying to focus on making sure you would always feel secure. Richard emphasized that no documents had ever been changed because of outside influence. Every legal safeguard remained exactly as Michael intended. Hearing those words lifted a burden I had been carrying for months. Whatever uncertainty existed within my family, it had not altered the promises Michael and I had made to one another. Before I left, Richard handed me a sealed envelope bearing today's date. Michael prepared instructions for several possible situations, he explained. "This envelope contains information you may eventually need, but I suggest waiting until you feel completely certain about your next step. There is no deadline. There is no pressure. Truth has a way of revealing itself without being rushed." I thanked him, placed the envelope inside my handbag beside Michael's letter, and drove home along the familiar tree-lined roads that Michael and I had traveled countless times together. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the windshield, painting shifting patterns across the dashboard. For the first time since Daniel announced his engagement, my thoughts felt surprisingly calm. I no longer needed to search for proof that my instincts had been real. I had already found something more valuable than proof. I had found perspective. That evening George Harris called to check on me after learning I had visited Richard's office. We spoke for nearly an hour. George never asked about legal details. Instead, he shared stories about Michael from their younger years, reminding me how patiently my husband approached every difficult decision. Just before ending the call, George hesitated for a moment before saying something that lingered in my thoughts long after I set the telephone down. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "sometimes people reveal their true character because they think nobody important is paying attention. The remarkable thing about truth is that it often has more witnesses than anyone realizes." At the time I did not fully understand what he meant. Only later, after the wedding day finally arrived and I remembered the many guests quietly holding their telephones during those unforgettable moments, did George's words begin to carry a very different meaning. The morning after the wedding I woke before sunrise, although I had barely slept. My navy dress hung neatly over the back of a chair in my bedroom, carefully cleaned as much as possible, but the faint stain remained. I chose not to throw it away. It had become more than a piece of clothing. It reminded me of the exact moment I stopped doubting my own instincts. I carried my coffee onto the back porch and listened to birds greeting another ordinary morning. Nature had a remarkable way of continuing without asking whether our hearts were ready to move forward. As the sunlight slowly reached across the yard, my telephone remained unusually quiet. No message arrived from Daniel. No apology appeared from Vanessa. Hours passed before my screen finally lit up with a short text from my son. He wrote that the reception had ended later than expected and that everyone was exhausted. He hoped I had arrived home safely and suggested they would talk after returning from their honeymoon. I read the message twice. It mentioned travel schedules, hotel checkout times, and flight confirmations. It never mentioned what had happened between us. That silence told me more than any explanation could have. I replied with only 4 words. "Travel safely. We will talk." Nothing more felt necessary. Around lunchtime George Harris stopped by carrying a loaf of fresh bread from the bakery Michael used to visit every Saturday morning. We sat together in the kitchen where so many family meals had once begun. George looked at me for a long moment before quietly asking whether I had spoken with Richard Coleman. I nodded and told him that Michael had left behind far more wisdom than paperwork. George smiled softly. "That sounds exactly like him," he said. Then his expression became more thoughtful. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed a small flash drive on the kitchen table between us. I looked at it without touching it. "What is this?" I asked. George folded his hands before answering. "One of the guests contacted me early this morning because he knew how close I was to Michael. He said he believed you should have this before rumors began spreading. He did not post anything online. He simply wanted you to have a complete record of what happened." I understood immediately without asking another question. Somewhere inside that small device rested the moments everyone in the ballroom had witnessed from different angles. George gently added that several guests had quietly expressed concern after the reception. Some had approached him because they remembered Michael's kindness over many years. Others admitted they had been shocked by how quickly the atmosphere changed and how uncomfortable Daniel appeared afterward. No one wanted to create a public spectacle. They simply believed the truth should remain preserved exactly as it happened. I thanked George but did not rush to view the recording. Instead, I placed the flash drive beside Michael's letter inside the study desk. Throughout my marriage I had learned that important decisions rarely improved when made in the middle of strong emotions. Later that afternoon Richard called to check on me. He did not ask whether I planned to use the recording or confront anyone immediately. Instead, he reminded me of something Michael often repeated during difficult seasons. Facts become stronger when they are allowed to stand quietly on their own. They do not need anger to make them believable. After ending the call, I finally inserted the flash drive into my computer. I watched only once. The recording showed exactly what I remembered. Guests chatting peacefully. Music filling the room. Vanessa approaching with a bright smile. The uncomfortable exchange that followed. My own decision to step away without raising my voice. What surprised me most was not the event itself but the reactions surrounding it. Faces that had looked shocked. Friends instinctively stepping forward before stopping themselves. Daniel remaining frozen, torn between confusion and hesitation. The recording contained no hidden twist, no dramatic revelation. It simply captured reality without emotion or opinion. When the screen went dark, I closed the laptop and sat quietly for several minutes. I realized then that I no longer needed anyone else to validate my experience. The truth already existed exactly as it had happened. It did not depend on memory, interpretation, or family loyalty. As evening settled over the house, I carefully placed the flash drive into the same envelope as Richard's sealed instructions and Michael's handwritten letter. 3 different reminders rested together inside my desk. One represented love. One represented preparation. One represented truth. I sensed that before long all 3 would become necessary, because sooner or later Daniel and Vanessa would return from their honeymoon believing they could continue life exactly where they had left it. They still thought the wedding had been the final chapter of an embarrassing family moment. They had no idea it had quietly become the beginning of a conversation that could no longer be postponed. 10 days later Daniel called and asked whether he and Vanessa could stop by on Sunday afternoon. His voice sounded lighter than it had in months, almost relieved, as though enough time had passed for everyone to quietly pretend the uncomfortable moments at the wedding had belonged to the past. I agreed without hesitation and spent the morning preparing a simple lunch. I set the dining table with the same white plates Michael and I had used for countless family meals. Fresh flowers rested in the center of the table, and sunlight filtered through the curtains exactly the way it always had. Nothing about the house suggested confrontation. I wanted the conversation to begin in the same place where our family had once shared ordinary happiness. When they arrived, Vanessa greeted me with a carefully practiced smile and handed me a small bouquet from the local grocery store. Daniel embraced me for a brief moment before stepping back. His eyes searched my face as though trying to measure whether I was still hurt or whether enough time had erased the memory for all of us. We exchanged polite conversation about their honeymoon, the weather, and the long drive home. Vanessa described beaches, restaurants, and sightseeing tours with effortless enthusiasm. Daniel laughed at a few stories, but I noticed he rarely looked directly at me for more than a second. The silence surrounding the wedding remained seated at the table with us even though nobody mentioned it. After lunch I poured coffee into Michael's favorite porcelain cups. That simple ritual had always slowed conversations enough for honesty to appear. Daniel finally cleared his throat and folded his hands together. "Mom," he said quietly, "I know things became awkward at the reception." He paused before continuing. "Everyone was under a lot of stress. Weddings can become emotional." Vanessa immediately nodded in agreement. She smiled politely and explained that the entire day had been overwhelming. She suggested people sometimes reacted poorly under pressure and that unfortunate misunderstandings happened in many families. I listened without interrupting. Neither of them described what had actually happened. Neither offered a direct apology. Their words floated around the truth instead of facing it. When they finished speaking, I stood and walked calmly into the study. I returned carrying 3 items that I placed gently on the dining table. Michael's handwritten letter remained inside its envelope. Richard Coleman's sealed instructions rested beside it. Finally, I set down the small flash drive without saying a word. Daniel looked puzzled. Vanessa's expression changed almost immediately. She stared at the flash drive for only a fraction of a second before looking away. It was the smallest reaction imaginable, yet impossible to miss once I had learned to observe rather than assume. I folded my hands and spoke as calmly as I could. "Your father taught me that families survive difficult moments by telling the truth before time turns silence into distance." Neither of them answered. I continued gently. "I have spent weeks asking myself whether I misunderstood what happened at your wedding. I no longer have that uncertainty." Daniel glanced from the envelope to the flash drive before looking back at me. "Mom, what is on that drive?" he asked quietly. "A complete record of the reception," I replied. "Nothing more and Nothing less. It simply shows what everyone present already witnessed. The room became very still. Vanessa lowered her coffee cup onto its saucer with deliberate care. She attempted a faint smile and suggested that recordings often failed to capture context or emotion accurately. I nodded. That is true, I answered. Which is why I watched it only once. Facts do not become stronger because we repeat them. They simply remain what they are. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair. For the first time since entering the house, he seemed genuinely unsettled. He looked toward Vanessa, then back toward me, as though discovering that the story he had been telling himself no longer fit comfortably beside the evidence resting on the table. I did not ask him to choose between his wife and his mother. I did not raise my voice or accuse anyone of malicious intentions. Instead, I reached for Michael's letter and rested my hand upon it. Your father left this for me years before the wedding, I said softly. He hoped I would never need to read it. He reminded me that respect cannot survive where honesty disappears. Daniel's shoulders slowly dropped. The confidence he had carried into the house was fading, replaced by uncertainty and regret. Vanessa remained silent, her attention fixed on the tabletop rather than on me. No argument followed. No dramatic confrontation filled the room. The quiet itself became impossible to ignore. As afternoon sunlight stretched across the dining room floor, I realized something important had finally changed. For the first time, neither Daniel nor Vanessa was trying to convince me that nothing had happened. They were beginning to understand that the conversation could no longer be postponed, and that before another word was spoken, each of us would have to decide whether our family would be rebuilt upon excuses or upon the truth. Daniel remained seated long after the conversation had fallen silent. He looked older than he had only an hour earlier, not because time had passed, but because certainty had left him. He slowly reached for the flash drive, then stopped before touching it. Instead, he looked at me with tired eyes and quietly asked, "Did Dad really know this might happen?" I glanced at Michael's letter resting on the table and answered honestly. Your father never claimed to know the future. He simply believed that respect should never depend on convenience, and he wanted to make certain I would never feel alone if difficult days arrived. Daniel lowered his head and covered his face with his hands for a long moment. Vanessa finally spoke, but the confidence that had once defined every word was gone. She admitted that she had allowed frustration and pride to influence her behavior during the wedding. She insisted she never intended for everything to become so public, yet even as she spoke, she understood that intentions no longer mattered as much as choices. I listened without interrupting because I had learned that people reveal more when they are not defending themselves against anger. When she finished, I asked only one question. If our places had been reversed, would you have accepted that explanation from me? She did not answer. She simply looked down at the untouched coffee in front of her. The silence that followed was different from every silence we had shared before. This one did not hide the truth. It acknowledged it. Daniel finally turned toward his wife and spoke with a calmness I had not heard in many months. He said they both needed to accept responsibility instead of searching for reasons that made uncomfortable choices seem understandable. Then he looked back at me and apologized without excuses, without conditions, and without asking me to erase what had happened. It was the first completely honest sentence I had heard from him in a very long time. I accepted his apology because forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. Forgiveness begins with honesty. Trust returns only through time. I explained that I would never use Michael's preparations or the legal protections he had arranged as weapons against my own family. They had been created to preserve peace, not to win arguments. The house would remain my home for as long as I wished to live there. Every future conversation about family, finances, or property would happen openly, with respect, and without hidden expectations. Richard Coleman would continue serving as my attorney exactly as Michael intended. Neither Daniel nor Vanessa objected. They understood that boundaries were not punishments. They were safeguards for relationships that deserved the opportunity to heal honestly. Before leaving, Daniel walked into the study alone. A few minutes later he returned carrying the framed photograph of Michael that Vanessa had once moved aside without a second thought. He carefully placed it back in the center of the living room mantel where it had always stood. It was a small gesture, but this time it came from his own heart rather than from obligation. As they prepared to leave, Vanessa quietly thanked me for allowing the conversation to happen instead of ending our relationship in bitterness. I wished them a safe drive home and watched their car disappear slowly beyond the maple trees lining the street. I did not know exactly what our family would look like in the years ahead. Healing is never immediate, and trust does not return because someone wishes it to. Yet for the first time since Michael passed away, I no longer felt that I had to carry every burden alone. His wisdom had guided me even after his final goodbye, and in doing so it had reminded me of something far more valuable than any inheritance. Dignity is not protected by raising your voice. It is protected by refusing to surrender your character when others forget theirs. A few weeks later I placed Michael's letter back inside the safe along with Richard's envelope and the small flash drive. They had served their purpose. I locked the compartment, returned the brass key to its familiar place, and closed the drawer with a peaceful heart. The house felt warm again as afternoon sunlight drifted across the hardwood floors. I poured myself a cup of coffee, settled into Michael's favorite chair, and smiled at the quiet around me. Families are never defined by perfect moments. They are defined by whether truth is welcomed when it finally arrives. Respect cannot be demanded. It cannot be inherited. It cannot be purchased. It is earned through everyday choices, protected by honesty, and strengthened by courage. That was the greatest gift my husband ever left behind, and it became the inheritance I hoped our family would carry long after every document inside that safe had lost its importance.